Hi guys, welcome back to the weird side of YouTube. I'm your host, author DC Knipe, and today we are going to be doing some book readings of my books. Since it is spooky month, I'm going to be reading from my 3 horror stories that I've written. This is the newest one, The Exorcist Acolyte. There is a full book reading of the first draft of this book on YouTube, but today we are just going to be reading the prologue. The Exorcist's Acolyte. Prologue, Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. I've come to learn that people are very similar to the earth when it was first created. The shape of our lives, the way we look at the world around us, how we react to different situations, depends on who or what gives us form. Each child starts life as a blank canvas, and depending on the artist in question, that can be either a beautiful or a terrifying sentiment. The story of my forming begins with one of my earliest memories. Along with my childhood friends, Lucas, Magdalena, Esther, and Levi, I was playing with in the massive cemetery surrounding the towering castle-like Omnideus United Church of the Righteous. Within the thick, constant fog of icy blue hue, we innocently played, as we had done countless times before. But that particular day, however, everything would change. It wasn't long after the pastor's sermon had ended when we found a red snake. Levi wasn't very impressed by it, Esther found it disgusting, and Lucas was afraid of it, calling it a devil of Genesis. Magdalena took to drawing it in her little sketch pad as she did everything she found interesting. I, however, was completely fascinated by its movements as it slithered through the patches of yellowed grass and across the barren earth. Its flicking forked tongue was completely alien to me. Its strange, emotionless eyes seemed to be filled with forbidden knowledge. Smiling, I crouched down before it, and it froze in place. Fearing that I had frightened it, I ignored Lucas's annoying words of warning and cautiously reached a trembling hand down to the fascinating creature. To my surprise, it lifted its little head to meet me halfway, actually allowing me to pet it, and after a few moments I cradled it in my arms and lifted it as I stood, proudly presenting it to my friends. Levi scoffed and shook his head, looking away and gazing mindlessly into the fog as he sat on the headstone before me. To the right of us, Esther looked as if we were sick to her stomach, as if she were sick to her stomach. Next to her, Magdalena sat, focusing intensely on her work, flashing concentrated glances at the snake every few moments. Behind and between them stood Lucas, praying desperately, tears streaming down his closed eyes as he clenched his pretty doll to his chest. It was then that I saw Pastor Blackburn standing behind him, his pale, gnarled hands tightly gripping the quietly crying boy's shoulder. Towering over all of us, he glared down at me with those dark, sunken eyes full of fiery wrath and judgment, and in his sickly voice, he said to me, "Those creatures are evil. They belong to and in the darkness, and they are only attracted to those weak enough to corrupt." I was only about 4 years old when I heard those words, but as young as I was, even then, I felt they rang hollow with untruthfulness, because of the teachings of his very church. Miss Mary taught us that God created all animals, I protested, picturing the young, kind, beautiful Sunday school teacher in my mind. And while they may be frightening, that doesn't mean they deserve disrespect. His thin lips curled up into a frightening smirk as he chuckled. "Is that so?" he asked, pulling his long, stringy, oily, flaxen hair away from his gaunt face. "Well, I'll have to have a word with Miss Mary about what darkness she's infecting children with." He then looked around at the rest of my friends as they slowly backed away from him and took their place by my sides. "What else has she been telling all of you?" Gulping, I thought of Miss Mary. The scent of her flowery perfume drifted into my nose as I saw her kind smile and heard her infectious laughter within my mind. I could picture the happy, colorful drawings we all made for her, covering the walls of her classroom. Of course, Magdalena's were always the most detailed and realistic, but Miss Mary never chose favorites. She found them all to be equally as beautiful. Pastor Blackburn didn't wait for an answer. Much to my surprise, he had opened a large, ornate knife in his other hand. Still gripping onto Lucas's shoulder, he reached the cross-shaped blade toward me. Now, destroy it. Sever the head from the body, he coldly commanded. This creature may just be a blessing in disguise, a lesson you can learn. A chill shot down my spine. Hearing the audible sounds of Esther's disgust, I defiantly stomped my foot into the ground. Before I knew it, I had screamed the word "no" at the top of my lungs. Blackburn's grin faded at once as he released his hold on Lucas. His tall, thin, hunched-over body slowly approached, casting a huge shadow over me. Esther, Levi, Magdalena, and my new serpent companion. Joshua, I realize that you are still young and inexperienced, he slowly breathed through his clenched, overlapping yellow teeth. But you should know by now exactly what happens to little boys who disobey their elders. God doesn't love insolent children. I gulped. My fury was suddenly replaced with fear. Images of hellfire dancing around me flashed throughout my mind. I could hear the tormented shrieks of the souls of the damned, clawing at my ears, feel my flesh burning and my eyes melting into my skull. And behind all this was Lucas's desperate prayers pleading with God to forgive me of my sins. Seeing the color leave my face as I began to tremble, the pastor was pleased. He stepped forward once again and shot his hand toward mine, grabbing it in the process and roughly jerking me toward him. This sent the serpent scurrying up my arms and shoulder in fright, but thankfully it did not bite me. My friends all scattered into the fog. I didn't blame them. By this point, even at such young ages, we knew all too well the consequences of angering Pastor Blackburn. In silence, the pastor placed the cold steel blade onto my palm and tightly wrapped my fingers around it. He then began to squeeze my tiny balled fist within his own, forcing my flesh against the edges of the blade. As it began to cut, he told me that this was only a fraction of the pain I would endure in damnation. And then, with a wide, mad grin on his terrifying face, he jerked the blade from my grasp, slicing through my skin in a dark moment of pure horror and agony. Screaming, I collapsed down onto my knees before him. Gazing down at the blood pouring from my wound, I wept. Pastor Blackburn's loud, maddening cackles filled the air, but my ear was taken by a quiet, subdued whisper, the whisper of the snake between licks of my ear as it lied stretched across my shoulders. Do not fear him, child. Why? Is my mustache being weird? Just then, before I had the time to react, Lucas ran up and pushed Pastor Blackburn over. He collapsed onto a grave beside me as the bloody knife fell to the ground, easily stabbing into the earth below. My crying eyes shot from the pastor to Lucas, who immediately told me to run away. Gasping, I hopped back onto my feet and turned around, carefully cradling the precious animal in my arms. Hearing Blackburn's growing rage behind me as he recuperated, I took off back toward the church. My feet stomped over the grave, sending dry dirt and dying grass flying into the air behind me as I prayed for forgiveness. As I ran toward the ancient church, I looked up at it. Built with dark, mossy stone and painted black planks of wood, it truly towered over everything, even the tallest of the ancient trees of the dead wood that surrounded the village. The large silver steeple that sprouted from the bell tower atop the back of the arched roof was so high up that it was usually hidden within the clouds. Along both sides of the massive building were beautiful and exquisitely detailed stained glass windows depicting the 12 disciples of Jesus. Usually they were glowing from the light within, illuminating the ever-present fog around the church. By the time I made it back inside the menacingly tall walls of the church, I was burning uncontrollably. I ran through the massive open sanctuary, heading down the middle path between the countless pews, heading toward the pulpit, its stone altar, and Pastor Blackburn's wooden podium. I hid beneath one of the front pews within the massive sanctuary and released the serpent onto the cold, black-pointed hardwood floor. It left a winding trail of my own blood in its wake as it slithered away to hide in the shadows, and as I watched as it disappeared, I tried my best to calm myself down. Within a few moments, I became distracted by the gigantic statue of Jesus and the cross at the end of the room, behind the pulpit. It was illuminated and somewhat silhouetted by the light from yet another stained glass window behind it, one that depicted a blue, sunlit, cloud-filled sky that represented heaven. Horrifically detailed with gore and blood, the statue itself hanged over the baptism pool. between the two large alcoves where the choir gathered to sing. Jesus' crying eyes seemed to look down at me, and I was frozen in fear. That statue of the crucifixion had always haunted my nightmares. It was then that Miss Mary appeared from the doorway to the right of the pulpit. She gasped, approaching the trail of blood. "Oh my goodness, is someone hurt?" she queried. Hearing me crying, she knelt down onto the floor and looked beneath the pews. Her brows arched in surprise and concern as she saw me. "Joshua, are you all right?" Soon she was cleaning out my wound with her in her classroom upstairs. She had me sit on the round table in the middle of the room, and she was knelt down in front of me. It hurt almost as much as the blade itself, but she comforted me with her sweet words, and as she did so, I tried to explain to her what happened. "You shouldn't have even been outside alone," she said, shaking her head. "Where on earth are your mother and father?" "I said I was with my friends," I whined. Rolling my eyes, I shrugged my shoulders and looked away. "Mother and father left right after Pastor Blackburn's sermon." She scoffed, obviously angry with my parents, but I could tell that, for my own sake, she was holding back on telling me how she really felt about them. "All of you children are too young to be out there in the fog, together or alone," she continued, wrapping up my hand with a bandage. "And you know disrespecting the pastor is wrong. He's dangerous when he's angry." She stared downwards and grew quiet, almost as if trying to gather her thoughts. I grew silent but nodded. Watching her continue to finish up, I became sad, however. My thoughts had ventured elsewhere. "Miss Mary?" I asked. After placing the medical supplies back onto the table before her, she glanced back up at me, arching her brows. "Yes, Joshua?" Her ocean eyes were glimmering in the light of the flickering candles that filled the classroom. How was she, were my mother? With that, I had leapt over the table and dove into her arms. Tears were already streaming down my face as she wrapped herself around me. She giggled a bit. "But then, who would be your Sunday school teacher?" she asked playfully. It seemed as though she was, again, holding herself back from acknowledging the very real issues at hand, but after a few moments I realized she was softly crying as well. Strangely, I went unpunished for it all, as Blackburn never mentioned it again. I had a sneaking suspicion that Miss Mary had something to do with that. She never more mentioned animals in her teachings, however, and a few months later she vanished for about a year. That would be the first in many mysterious disappearances for her, one the adults called missions. Miss Mary had become our first and only missionary, which raised a number of unanswered questions for me at the time. I didn't see Lucas for quite a long time after that either. Whenever I asked someone about him, including my mother and his parents, they would simply say that his disrespect toward the pastor was nigh unforgivable, and that he needed to atone for his sins. He had been sent somewhere to do that. My nights were plagued by my wild imagination after that. What sort of horrible place had they sent him to? How was he to atone? Was it painful? I dared not ask. When he finally returned to Sunday school a few years later, he was completely silent, even when spoken to directly. He had grown eerily thin, as if he had been starving to death, and seemed completely exhausted. Though he looked to be clean, a strange, gut-wrenching stench seemed to radiate out of his flesh. His skin was now a ghostly white and unnervingly thin, so that bluish-black veins could be seen pulsating just underneath it. These could be seen on every part of him that his little suit did not cover. His once bright brown eyes were now dull and listless, retreating into his skull as they gazed off into nothingness, slowly blinking, and that once bright blonde hair was now flaxen, grayed, and thinning. The strange thing was, no one mentioned his appearance. No one tried to speak to him like I did, not even Miss Mary. Magdalena was silently drawing him as she ignored our teacher's words as usual, capturing his eerily dead stare with perfect accuracy. Esther seemed absolutely terrified of him, refusing to even look in his direction with her widened eyes, though she did give me some questionable looks when I tried to get him to communicate. And Levi tried to act as if nothing was wrong, but that in itself seemed incredibly strange. During Mary's teachings, I watched Lucas in silence, her words muffled as they hit my ears. He was ignoring Magdalena's current project, but was staring at the drawings on the wall, specifically the newer ones we had made within his absence. His eyes were hollow, devoid of life and light, and it didn't even appear as though he were breathing. In every manner, our Lucas resembled a corpse. Soon, Pastor Blackburn began his sermon, which sounded just as venomous and full of vitriol as usual. It was about having to fulfill certain duties as God's children. The examples he gave were for women to be subservient to their men, for men and women to be fruitful and multiply the earth, and for children to honor their fathers and mothers. He expounded on that last one to include adults in general, however, saying it was not a child's place to question, but to happily and eagerly obey. And any and all refusal was to disrespect God himself. One may as well sign over their soul to Lucifer, he screeched. It wasn't uncommon for the pastor's sermons to target certain individuals of the congregation. Usually it wasn't obvious to anyone but the intended, however. This angry rant was clearly about Lucas as well as my friends and I. That's when Lucas revealed his madness, leaping over people's heads and climbing over pews, making his way to the pulpit, growling and foaming at the mouth like some sort of rabid beast. It sounded as if he were screaming words in another language, or even more frighteningly, speaking backwards. He ignored the uproar behind him, including the desperate pleading of his own parents, and faced off against the pastor as if no one existed but the two of them. The dim, fog-filtered light of day that shone through the stained glass windows seemed to fade. Those countless candles on the massive chandelier above us all died in the unnatural chill that followed, and the air around me grew strangely thick and heavy, making it somewhat hard to breathe, and I was horrified. This was exactly like one of my nightmares come to life. Pastor Blackburn's sword was a crucifix, his shield the Holy Bible as he went to battle with the boy's darkness. His shrieks of the ancient scriptures did little to ease my terrified young heart, however, and so I covered my ears and desperately tried to run out into the light of day. My mother violently gripped me, however, holding me still on her lap. She kept my blue eyes wide open with her fingers while my father forced my hands to my sides from his seat beside her. Giggling sadistically, they held me there, both determined to make me watch the torture that was about to take place. Honor thy father and mother, but my parents had never acted like a father and mother. Even when I was a child, they ignored me, and when I was horrified of something, like this very moment, they made me witness it until my screams burned my throat and my tears ran dry. And if my cries were heard in public, once I got home, they would take turns beating me with my father's belt until my behind was covered in blue bruises and bleeding gashes. Spare the rod, spoil the child, after all. As I sobbed, the deacons of the church flooded into the aisles and made their way up to the pulpit. There they held Lucas in place as he continued to speak backwards, his voice unnaturally deep and rough, spit flying out of his mouth at every direction. This reminded me of the day that he was baptized. He was terrified, but they held him under the water, much like this. He fought just as much then, splashing about violently with his arms and legs. Somehow I knew, however, this time they were not going to let him up for air. It was then that Pastor Blackburn revealed a small pearlescent tear-shaped vial of what I would eventually learn was holy water. He popped the cork from its mouth before splashing a few droplets onto Lucas, and the reaction was something I would have never expected. The boy loudly shrieked in agony, steam rising from his face. It had actually burned through his flesh, leaving sizzling, fleshy holes in his cheeks. It seemed he was no longer Lucas after all. In the name of Jesus the Christ, you will leave this boy, foul demon, Blackburn shrieked, firmly pressing the iron crucifix to Lucas's forehead, eliciting yet another chilling wail of pain. Upon removing it, the pastor revealed that the red shape of the cross had been inexplicably burned into the skin of Lucas's forehead, filling the entire sanctuary with a disgusting stench of burning flesh. Return to the files of hell from which you crawled forth. At that point, Lucas went limp. He collapsed into the floor between the deacons, between the first sets of pews and the pastor, standing before the large altar that rested just in front of the pulpit. It was as if all life had been drained from the boy's body, drawn out by that very crucifix, and all was deathly silent and eerily still for a moment or two, as if time itself had frozen. It was in that very second that I finally noticed the shadow that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Just behind that gory statue of Jesus hanging on the cross was a large black silhouette. Seemingly standing on the water of the baptism pool, it was formed and looked as if it were kneeling down, hiding, its hands slightly gripping, its claws stabbing into the wood at the bottom of the cross. Glowing red eyes blinked and slowly looked around, taking it all in, and then they met my confused and curious glance. The creature seemed surprised and vanished at once. The silence was broken by the terrified screams of the other children. They cried and wailed as their parents did their best to calm them. Strangely, I was now completely silent as I continued to watch the events unfold. Seeing this, my parents released me, pleased by my newfound bravery. Then the deacons all solemnly lifted Lucas's ragdoll body. They held him like pallbearers did a casket at a funeral, raising him to their shoulders, each of them holding a section of one of his extremities as they took him out of the sanctuary. The double doors were shut behind them, and once again my childhood friend was lost to me, to all of us. Blackburn returned to the pulpit and continued roaring like a beast, his fiery words reverberating off the sanctuary walls. His terrifying voice seemed to calm the babies and young children in the audience as their cries died down at that point. He spoke of demons and angels, saying that they both walked among us, and that our actions were what invited them into our lives. Lucas invited the devil in, he shrieked. He did so by showing disrespect to God, by dishonoring his father and mother, by disobeying me. That boy refused to make amends, and thus his condition worsened. It was then that I could hear Lucas's mother sobbing from the other side of the sanctuary. I turned to her, seeing her husband try and comfort her. They both seemed to be completely broken-hearted. You saw the evil within him. Our beloved Lucas, I'm afraid, is no longer Lucas. Alas, he has been rendered to little more than a mere puppet, Blackburn continued from behind this podium. And who is pulling the strings? The devil himself. It seemed as though everyone in the audience gasped upon hearing these words, including my own parents. I remained silent, however, and continued to listen. And now he will have to face God's wrath in the form of an exorcism, concluded the pastor, and with that the sermon ended. The choir behind him on either side began to sing the praises of Jesus beneath the gigantic and eerie statue of the Christ, eternally bleeding, dying, suffering, suffocating on that cross. In a loud din, their voices filled the entire sanctuary as the bells of the tower began to ring above us. Everyone stood up from their seats and began to flood into the aisles in order to make their way outside. I'm not certain how all of this affected the rest of my friends. As we grew up, it was something that none of us ever even dared to mention. We were all far too afraid to bring it up, it seemed, which in itself, I suppose, lies the answer. They were each just as scarred from the experience as I was. Lucas's memory remained with me, as did the hole he left in my heart. The scar Blackburn cut into my hand never faded. These moments were what shaped my young mind like God once did the earth. And this was only the beginning. This was my genesis. That is the prologue from my newest horror story. It is a novella called The Exorcist Acolyte. It takes the... My necklace just broke. I can fix it later. It takes the traditional classic tropes of demonic possession and exorcism and kind of flips them on their heads, kind of twists to it at the end. It's kind of science fiction-y, really horror, really dark, gory. I'm really proud of it. You can buy it, you can print it by order, which means just you order one and it's printed from lulu.com right now, link in description. Or you can get one of these special editions that come with, it'll be signed, and it'll come with a piece of themed jewelry. So that's fun. And link in that description too. It's at prismaticdreams.com, my shop. But yeah, this is the first of 3 novellas I'm going to be reading for this month for October, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Other than that, I love you guys, and I hope I see you guys next time. Thank you for your support. Happy Spooky Month.